Okay, so all your cameras are off and microphones are muted. What I'll do then is I'll get started, and Abby will monitor the inbox for me as well. And Abby, if you just shout out if there are any issues or anything that you need to make me aware of, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, so a brief introduction about myself and about DSW. So I've been working in the world of awarding really within FE and HE since 2006. Worked primarily for awarding organisations, and I've been now with DSW for just over 5 years, where I'm Director of Apprenticeships and I oversee the endpoint assessment side of the business. So I'm really managing the quality team and the delivery team, the product team, but also a key part of my role, which is kind of richly rewarding really and gives me lots of excellent insights into industry, is engaging with training providers and employers and indeed apprentices. And it's a real privilege to be able to do that because I get access to lots of information and different points of view. And it's forums like this where I try and share that with you as broadly as I can. So DSW, we're in our 25th year now, so we formed in 1999. We were, I believe, the first kind of endpoint assessment organisation to get off-call approval, other than those that were traditional awarding orgs that had that approval. So we've had that status for a long time now. We've carried out about 11,000 endpoint assessments now across 37 different standards. So we specialised in the early days of financial services, and we do the majority of endpoint assessments in that space. But we also now operate in a lot of the pan-sector areas, including HR, leadership and management, business admin. So we work with over 190 different providers, and that's every different type of provider you can imagine. So lots of independent training providers, but also FE colleges, employer providers, HEIs and universities. And at any given time, we're carrying out endpoint assessment for over 2,000 employers. And the last little image on there you'll see is an NPS, and this isn't something I was familiar with actually until I joined DSW, and that's known as a Net Promoter Score, and that's used to gauge kind of how satisfied our customers are with us. And 81 is an exceptional score, so it's something we're very proud of. And hopefully by continuing to engage with you in sessions like this and one-to-one, you know, we can continue to listen and continue to share best practice and give you the best service possible. Okay, so I'll just give you an overview of the agenda. So we'll start with what on earth I mean by this pretentious title of Laggards, Luddites and Leaders. Then I want to talk about the different types of generative AI specifically. So I think generative AI is the one that we're all talking about in the main when we're talking about the world of work and assessment and learning. Then I wanted to break it down into what I would broadly describe as 3 categories. So how is AI being applied in the workplace, first of all? And we've got a sort of mini case study there around Deloitte, who are kind of ahead of the curve really in their adaptation of it. Then I wanted to talk about generative AI and how it's used in education. So particularly kind of the training providers that we work with and how they're using it to inform their curriculum design and how to support learners in the delivery of training. And then finally, I wanted to talk about awarding organisations, and from our perspective and from the kind of work and collaboration we've done with other AOs, is how are we using it in a responsible and effective manner? And then really, how do we tie those 3 things in together, which I think is the key, and that's the key takeaway I think that we need to take from this session and the conversations that we have subsequently. And then finally, I just wanted to recap on what are the risks of AI, because I think although it presents lots of opportunities, the more I use it personally, the more I can see its flaws and the risks that are associated with it. So I think it's important that we have a balanced view where we look at the benefits, but also the risks. And then finally, critically, is how do we work together to support learners so they understand when they can use it, but then if they are using it, how they do that sort of safely and appropriately and effectively, and how they can, for example, reference the work so that they're clear as to when they've used it and why they've used it and how that's acceptable in line with their own organisation's working practices and policies and procedures. And then hopefully plenty of time left at the end for questions. Okay, then let's start with that pretentious title that I came up with. So Laggards, Luddites and Leaders. One thing I should have said as well is that we're going to have polls throughout. So we've got 5 poll questions, and it'll be the opportunity for everybody to answer those questions, and we can look at the results live. And that'll just hopefully inform the discussion and the question and answer session that we have as well. So I've got three images on the screen here. So the first one is something that's called the Gartner hype cycle. And it's not something I was familiar with until fairly recently, actually, when I started discussing this with a colleague of mine, our chief executive. Second image on there, I'm sure a lot of you will recognize, are the Luddites. And the third image is Steve Jobs, obviously the co-founder of Apple. And I thought it's interesting actually just to put AI and our collective sort of adoption of it in terms of these three sort of windows or reference points, if you like. There are others, but I thought actually, no, I'm going to force us to think of it in terms of these three. And I'm going to ask you about where you think we are in terms of these three as well, because I think that stops us from sitting on the fence, I think, and saying, oh, well, we're in the middle. I want us to think about actually, are we behind or are we ahead on this, and really use that to drive what we do next. So if we start with the Gartner hype cycle, so I think the eagle-eyed of you, the first thing you'll notice is it isn't a cycle, so I'm not quite sure why it's called that. But nonetheless, I think it's quite an insightful tool for us to use to think about where we are with AI and how it's kind of been adopted and what the future looks like. So with the hype cycle, what you've got is you start off with an innovation trigger, and this is really where somebody comes up with a bright idea of this new way of working or this new technology or this new product that we've got. And then that goes out to market. And then what we typically see is the peak of inflated expectations. And this is where it's all over the media. And this is sort of hyperinflated now with the emergence of the internet and social media. And there's a load of hype about it. And there are real good news stories about how it's being adopted and used, and that it's a real game changer. And it's the next best thing since sliced bread. Sometimes a kind of a product or an innovation might stay up there or around about there. But often what we see throughout history is actually that peak of inflated expectations dips. And there are a number of reasons that that can happen, and we can explore a couple of those. And then we fall into what's wonderfully titled trough of disillusionment. Love that. And that's where actually people start to adopt the technology, and for whatever reason they're dissatisfied with it, or for whatever reason it isn't largely adopted in the way that it was anticipated it would be. And I can give you a couple of examples through history where that's happened or is currently happening, actually. So the first would be laser discs. So those of you of a certain age will be familiar with these, slightly before my time just. But this was a technology that emerged in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And actually, it was a new format that could be used to kind of watch films, movies, TV shows. And it was by far, in terms of the fidelity of it, it was a superior product to everything else in the market. So the main competitors at the time were VHS and Betamax. So it was much better in terms of the picture quality and the sound quality and so forth. So we reached that peak of inflated expectations immediately when everyone says, right, this is a game changer. The days of VHS are over. But what we found was that we fell quite steeply and quite quickly into that trough of disillusionment. And I said before, there are lots of different reasons that that might happen. I think when it comes to laser discs, fundamentally that happened largely because the cost of the players that played the disc was just too high, and the cost of the discs themselves were too high. So despite the fact that this was clearly a superior technology and something that everyone was really excited about, it just didn't take off, certainly not in Europe and North America. Did in some sort of niche affluent areas of Asia, I believe, but broadly speaking, as a product, it did not perform anywhere near it was sort of expected to. And that pretty much died a death, to be honest. What we can see is that a product or a service or an innovation might go into that trough of disillusionment, and then there's this slope of enlightenment where actually people continue to adopt it and continue to figure out what its flaws are and how you kind of overcome those flaws, and it becomes a widely adopted technology, but it hits this sort of plateau of productivity, if you like. So it's not quite the game changer that you thought it was, but nor is it something that's completely flopped like a laser disc did and becomes pretty much redundant. So another example I'd give would be electric cars, so something that we're all familiar with. And actually throughout the decades, there have been a number of sort of attempts to make electrically powered vehicles, but that really took off, I think, with Tesla more recently. And we hit that peak of inflated expectations where everybody was talking about how brilliant these machines were and how, you know, the performance of them was excellent and the tech on them was unparalleled. And vehicle manufacturers throughout the world declared, actually, right, we're going to stop making petrol-powered vehicles, and we're going to stop making diesel-powered vehicles, and we're going to focus purely on electric. And we've seen that across all different manufacturers all across the globe. And indeed governments as well kind of committing to net zero and jumping on that bandwagon and saying, right, okay, well, we're going to have electrically powered vehicles. But actually, I think what we're seeing now with electric vehicles is we're heading towards that trough of disillusionment. And the same factor as we had with the laser discs, part of that's because they're just so bloody expensive. Because the cost of them is starting to fall now, but they're still very expensive compared to traditionally powered vehicles. But we also have other factors like the lack of charging points. The infrastructure is just not there to support it on the scale that it was planned to be delivered at. Concerns from drivers' cars about the range of the vehicles and actually, is it going to conk out when I'm on my way to work? But then also actually concerns around and risks associated with the mining of the lithium that's required for the batteries that power these vehicles. So the geopolitical risks associated with it, but actually, ironically, there's considerable environmental damage that's done in mining those materials and in producing these cars kind of on scale globally. So the irony is something that was seen as a game changer because it was going to kind of spearhead a green revolution is actually something that's potentially seen as being very harmful. So the market, I think, and indeed governments and manufacturers have sort of put the brakes on it and I think, hang on a second, this isn't quite what we anticipated it would be. So electric cars, I would also place kind of heading certainly towards that trough of disillusionment. So just a couple of examples then. I gave you those examples really, and I've shared that hype cycle with you because I think personally, with AI, certainly in the world of apprenticeships and education, I think we've probably just about hit that peak of inflated expectations. And from my own experience of using platforms like ChatGPT, maybe I'm starting to head toward the trough of disillusionment. Longer term, do I think it's going to die a death like laser discs? Nope. I think it's absolutely here to stay. But I think that we'll probably explore in this webinar, certainly in the months and years to come, what the risks are associated with that and actually how we get onto that slope of enlightenment and hit that plateau of productivity, which is where I think we need to aim if we're being realistic and pragmatic about it. So the second image on there are the Luddites. So I'm sure most, if not all of us, are familiar with the Luddites. So they're a 19th century movement, and they were most famous for destroying the machinery that was used to produce kind of textiles. And primarily, I mean, their concerns were really about sort of job losses and wages and things like that. And I think when we think of Luddites in the context of the modern day, it's become a byword, I think, for people who are just arbitrarily opposed to progress and, just smash things because they're scared of it. Whereas I think that's slightly unfair on the people of the time and the people that were part of that movement. I think that's an element of it, and it's a legitimate element of it, because indeed that did go on to realize that fear to a large extent. But also, I think there were concerns around the lack of the artisan aspect of what they did in terms of producing really good, high quality sort of goods and products that had a human feel to them and that were created by a talented individual. And I think that applies, to be honest, to the world of education as well. I think, it's great. You can look at big data and we can use AI to drive things and be more efficient. But it's really important that we don't lose that human touch, especially when we're dealing with learners and their individual educations and their futures. So I think that the Luddites, maybe there's a part of a Luddite in each of us as well. And then finally, and I won't dwell on this, but obviously we all know who Steve Jobs is, co-founder of Apple. I would absolutely consider him to be a leader in the world of tech and innovation for obvious reasons. He co-founded that company. Not only did he demonstrate the excellent leadership, but he knew what they needed to do with the tech and with the product in order to make it a success. And it's funny because I'm sure a lot of people have seen at the time that they launched the iPhone, you had execs from Microsoft being interviewed and sort of scoffing at it and saying nobody's going to pay that much money for a phone. And what they fundamentally failed to realize was it was way more than a phone. And indeed, those of us that have smartphones now, they do everything for you. We're completely reliant upon them. And I think the likes of Steve Jobs were really visionary and they saw that opportunity in it. So it's really thinking outside of the box around how technology can reform our lives and our ways of work, and then how we can really sort of manifest that and harness that to the best of our ability. So I actually neglected to ask the first poll question when I should have, so apologies for that. So I'll do that now. It was really just to want to capture kind of who you are and what type of organization you work for. So I'm just going to launch that now. And Abby, if you can just let me know if that's visible.
Yeah, it's visible.
Super. Yeah. So I'll leave that up for sort of 30 seconds, a minute or so, just to gauge a feel for who we've got and what blend of people we have. And there's a reason for asking that because, like I say, we'll look at the world of employers, the world of providers, and the world of reward and logs, and how each of us is and can adapt this technology. Yeah, great. I mean, the split's more or less where I suspected it would be, so I'll publish that for you. So the vast majority of people are from training providers. We've got some award and orgs on there. We've got one employer and four others who I suspect maybe consultants and so forth. So I think that's good. I think the blend of training providers and award and orgs I think is essential because the employers are going to do what the employers are going to do in terms of using AI. I think it's for training providers to figure out how they adapt their curriculum and the way that they support and train. And I think it's for award and orgs to figure out how we accept that work and assess it in a way that's reliable and valid. Super. So I will ask the next question immediately. Sorry, I don't think I've shared that. So the next question is, thinking of not you as an individual, but us as a sector, which of these three categories would you put us into? And when I say as a sector, I really mean training providers and award and orgs. So are we laggards in that, or something that we're aware it's there, we haven't really taken the time yet to adopt it? Or we Luddites in that, oh God, terrified of it? Or we leaders in that, well, actually, we really are embracing this technology and spearheading its use? About 55, 60 responses in there, so I'll leave it another 20 seconds or so. Brilliant. And that share. So that's really interesting. So the vast majority of us think that we're laggards. And to be honest, personally, I would say that I agree with that. I think there are pockets of the other two categories. In terms of I've spoken to people who are really opposed to it and terrified as to what it's going to do in terms of that it's going to do me out of a job. And obviously there are people in the sector who are real leaders in it and really helping others to understand how we can adopt the technology. But broadly speaking, I think I would agree with the laggard piece. It's interesting because we knew it was coming, and ChatGPT has been around for a couple of years now, but it still feels like it took us slightly by surprise, which is an interesting consideration. Great. We'll share these results as well with you when we share the slide deck as well, just so you can share it with your colleagues and people in your network. Okie dokie. I shall move on to the next section. Okay, so now we're going to look at the different types of AI, and actually I'm focusing purely on generative AI because I think this is the key bit that we're all using in the main in our work, and it's the key bit that we're coming across when we're assessing and teaching learners. So I think this is what we need to focus on. So the first one there on the top left is text-to-text generators. So the most obvious kind of one of those is ChatGPT. That's a system that I use on almost a daily basis now, to be honest. And the way text-to-text generators work is you input written instructions, and what it does is it will respond to those instructions. So you might ask it to do something, or you might ask it to answer a question. But the critical thing is it's designed to generate human-like responses. And that's really useful in the world of work because it can really speed things up in terms of chatbots is a classic example of that, which have been around for a long time now. But this is, I think, where probably the main risk is at the moment in education is in terms of how that might be abused by learners when they're submitting work for assessment. So there was a really interesting article in FE Week a couple of weeks ago, actually, and if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to dig it out, where they've done some research there and spoken to kind of key industry figures around concerns around social media, and TikTok was an example that they really honed in on, where there's actually a sort of cottage industry there of organizations that are creating sort of mods and add-ons and things like that that can encourage learners to use AI to kind of cheat, and they use that term cheat quite brazenly, but also kind of adaptive technologies that will help them to cover the fact that they've used artificial intelligence. So they might input other pieces of work that they have written, and what it'll do is it'll adapt the prose of the AI output so that it matches their style of writing, so it's harder to detect. And interestingly, a spokesperson from the Department for Education, who's on record on that FE Week article, actually made a comment that there are technologies, obviously, that are available to us that are designed to detect AI use, but even in DFA's own view, they're far too slow at adapting, and actually the kind of cheat technology is just adapting at a way quicker pace. So I think as an industry, we need to start thinking about, okay, well, do we continue to just try and chase the technology and fall further and further behind, or do we think more fundamentally around things like the way that we teach people and the types of assessment that we use? So I actually think this is where endpoint assessment in the world of apprenticeships is probably it's relatively AI proof, because the main risk really is where you've got assignment based activities. So, university theses and things like that, where a learner might generate some stuff and actually heavily rely on AI to do it and cover their tracks. And there's a real risk there that we don't catch them. There's also a real risk there that we accuse them of having used it and they haven't, but that's a different story, I think. But yeah, there's a risk with that type of assessment. But when it comes to endpoint assessment, because we're using a blend of assessment methods and because we're assessing behaviors and skills, it's not all knowledge based. I think it's relatively AI proof, because even if somebody generates something in a portfolio of evidence or in a report that they've done for a project, typically speaking, in endpoint assessment, that will be scrutinized in something like a Q&A session with the independent assessor, or a professional discussion, or an interview. And I think that's where, as assessment organizations and awarding organizations, we need to be savvy in terms of training our assessors to identify where they suspect it might have taken place, and then to use the questioning really effectively to be able to drill down and test, does that person actually know what they're talking about? Or is it something that they've got AI to generate for them and they don't really know what they're talking about? So I think there's an art that will evolve there in terms of the way that we assess. But broadly speaking, I think the methodology that's used in endpoint assessment massively protects us against it. And the fact that one of the real beauties of apprenticeships is that it's not just about knowledge, it's about how you apply that knowledge and how you behave in the workforce. And it's much more difficult to fake skills and behaviors using something like AI than it is to fake knowledge. So the second one on there, which is on the top right, is an image-to-image generator, and Pix-to-Pix is an example of that. And what they'll do is they will take an existing image, and it might be a still image or a video image, and they'll manipulate it based on user instructions. So, you might have seen this if you're on social media, of people posting images of themselves and you think, that doesn't look quite like you. And where they might have used AI to make themselves look a little bit younger or a little bit slimmer, or make me look like a 1940s movie star, that sort of thing. I think it's probably less common in the majority of cases than the text-to-text generators, but obviously it's something that's out there and we need to be aware of. The third category, which is bottom left, are the text-to-image generators. So Midjourney's a classic example of that. And this is where you'll put text into Midjourney and ask it to create an image. And it's really great fun, but it also has practical work-based applications as well. Again, this is probably something you've seen if you're on social media. I know, if I think of my family, I've got a WhatsApp group with my brothers and sisters, and my niece loves Paddington. And my oldest brother loves to go into Midjourney and ask it to create images of Paddington as Rambo, or Paddington as a Star Wars stormtrooper, and those sorts of things. So it's great fun, but actually there are risks associated with it, and it is something that in a lot of occupations we will see apprentices using. So we need to be mindful of it. And then finally, fourth category on the bottom right are the image to text generators, for example, show and tell. And this is where you'll input an image or a video into the AI model and you'll ask it to describe it. So it might say, okay, there's a party and there's a boy who's just popped a balloon and a girl's crying. This has real potential, I think, in terms of helping us to facilitate reasonable adjustments in the workplace, in the world of learning, and in the world of assessment. So, for example, if you've got somebody that's partially sighted or blind, and there's an assessment that requires them to analyze images, well, this sort of technology is perfect for that. So the opportunities are in kind of, enhancing the way that we work, increasing efficiencies, but also assessing more effectively and more reliably and consistently, and in a way that's fairer for people that have certain access arrangements. I'm going to just pause there and then see if there are any questions in the Q&A section. Yeah, there aren't any currently, so I'll just wait a moment if anyone wants to pop one in. Otherwise, I shall move on. Okay, I'll move on. Abby, if you don't mind just keeping an eye on that and then give me a shout if anything pops up, please, that would be great.
Yeah, there's also just one popped up.
Ah, yes, thank you. Yeah, so there's also Copilot and Microsoft, which is Microsoft AI. Yeah, I haven't used that personally, but I've heard really good things about it actually, and how it can sort of coordinate different applications across the Microsoft suite. So it's just emerging really, really quickly. And I think, like I say, it's not something that I would claim to be an expert in, but it's very exciting in my view. I'm more excited about it than I am afraid. I think that's something we'll come on to shortly. Right, so I wanted to talk next about application of AI in the workplace. So this is the first of the three categories that I described at the beginning. So we're in the business of assessing people in their world of work. Okay, so apprenticeships aren't about filling in a workbook and then there's your certificate. It's really about how have you developed yourself in terms of the occupation that you're doing and the apprenticeship standard that you're on. And so observing real work activities is the best way to do that, rather than hypothetical stuff or theoretical stuff. It's the actual work they've done and how they've gone about it. So with that in mind, I think it's absolutely critical that we understand how AI is being used in the workplace in order for us to assess it effectively. So if we start on the top left with innovation and creativity, so we've got advancements such as machine learning, which really allow organizations to create sort of personalized products and services for the customers. And what machine learning will do is it will analyze kind of the preferences, the behaviors, and the interactions of those customers, of those end users. And then it will use that to inform the products and the services and the ways of working that the organization will adapt. So it's a really sort of adaptive technology, which allows organizations to innovate and stay ahead of the curve based purely upon AI kind of monitoring what somebody's doing and saying, right, okay, it likes it when I do that. It doesn't really like that, and adapting itself to meet that. And also, I think generative AI models like, say, ChatGPT can be used to create new content. And that's something that I use, I said at the beginning, on an almost daily basis. So I wouldn't use it to create, say, a question bank for an assessment, because there's all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't do that. But I will use it to help me write emails or to help me reword things for policy documents, presentations about AI, that sort of thing. So it can be used, but I think, you need to be really careful when you use it to create content, because there are all sorts of issues that are associated with that, which I'll talk about shortly. So on the top right there, I think another kind of benefit of it being applied in the workplace is increased accuracy and consistency. So what I would say is that for a large range of tasks, so not all tasks, but for a large range of tasks, it can significantly improve accuracy and consistency, and is a lot more accurate and consistent than a human being. But it's not infallible. And some of you might have heard of this, another wonderful term, but hallucinations in the context of AI. And this is a phenomena where it might generate content that's erroneous or irrelevant or sometimes completely nonsensical. And that can be caused by, poor inputting of data by the user. It can be caused by the model itself having biases. It can be caused by the training of the model. So when we talk about training an AI model, the way that AI models are trained is they're trained by the data that we put into them. So it's learning all the time from what we tell it. And actually, if we're telling it a load of rubbish all the time, it's going to learn a load of rubbish, and then it's going to spout a load of rubbish in the future. So for that reason, we need to be really careful when we're using it, that we don't completely rely on the outputs, because it's often wrong. And I can give you some examples of that. So a colleague of mine used it to create a report and to include references within that report, and it did it. And then he was looking at the references and he thought, well, it doesn't quite sound right. And so it asked ChatGPT. My colleague said, can you just explain a bit more about this reference and where did it come from? And ChatGPT actually said to my colleague, oh, I made that up. It's not a real reference. And that's a true story. And ChatGPT has been known to do things like that quite a lot. Another example, I was talking to a training provider just last week, actually, and they gave an example of where somebody'd used ChatGPT in a legal setting, and it referred to a law or a piece of legislation. And this case was thrown out of court, and it turned out that the law that it referred to wasn't a real law. And again, it was something that ChatGPT had just completely made up. And again, when you talk about sort of nonsensical output that I described before, you'll all have seen this where you might have an image that's generated and people will be saying, that looks a bit dodgy. Is it generated by artificial intelligence? And when you look at it, someone's got 3 arms and 7 fingers on one hand. So it does stuff like that all the time. And I think when we start thinking about it, we can think of loads of examples where we've seen that. So it's really important. If it can make such basic, simple errors as that, when we're asking it to do really complicated things and to crunch, big data, can we really be reliant upon what it's outputting if it can't even get basic stuff right on a consistent basis? On the bottom right there, we have enhanced decision making. And again, I would use something like the example I gave around, I'm forgetting the name of it now, apologies. So, but anyways, enhanced decision making is where basically what the AI does is it has access to these huge data sets, and it can see the hidden patterns in the data that essentially human beings can't see. So we are physically incapable of kind of manipulating all of that data, but AI models can do that. So really it sees those hidden patterns inside of the data that we can't see. And then finally, we have increased efficiency and productivity. And I think what a lot of people don't know is one of the big benefits of AI is that you can describe to it your ways of working, and you can say, right, okay, here's a flow chart for a particular process that we've got in our organization. And what it'll do is it'll analyze that flow chart for you using all of that training that it has. So it's looked at millions of other examples of a similar process, and it will tell you where you perhaps have got some waste or some duplication in that particular process, or where you might be able to increase it by reducing steps in the process, reducing the number of touch points, reducing the number of stakeholders that have to get involved. And that sort of thing.
Jake, I was just going to say, we've got a question.
Super, thank you. Just go to that. Okay, so question from our end. So when we type things into ChatGPT, I've heard mixed information about it using what we type in to train the models. Do you have references in relation to this, perhaps? Some people say it does scrape what we put in to train models, and others say that it doesn't. So that's a good question. So it is something that I've looked into, and from the reading that I've done from OpenAI, which is obviously the organization that created ChatGPT, my understanding is that it does, so everything that you're putting into it, it will potentially use to train itself, so that when you have the next iteration of it, it'll use that information collectively to kind of inform how it advises users in the future. And that's another thing that I've come across actually, is advice being given to, say, an awarding organization like ourselves, is that if you've got a piece of evidence that's been submitted by an apprentice and you think it might have been generated by ChatGPT, and believe me, I've seen a lot of them, because there are telltale signs. You can often tell straight away from the format of the text and the fact that it's got the American spelling in and Z's where there should be, Z's where there should be F's. It's in that circumstance, I wouldn't take that and put it into ChatGPT. I've heard it been advised to do that and ask ChatGPT, did the learner write this? And you shouldn't. Firstly, because the learner owns that intellectual property and we don't have their consent to use it. If you do, fair enough. You can do that. But the other thing is ChatGPT is notoriously unreliable. And if you look on OpenAI's website, they will tell you that ChatGPT doesn't possess the functionality to check its own work and tell you whether it authored it. Now it will tell you. So if you put it into ChatGPT, it will say, yeah, I wrote that, even though it knows itself that it's incapable of making that determination. So it's another example of where you just can't rely on what it's saying, because it will just make stuff up. And actually Forbes produced an article back end of last year, which is worth a read as well, where they looked at this very issue, and they, I believe, inputted a piece of work, an article I think someone had written in 2012, put it into ChatGPT and said, did you write this? And ChatGPT came back and said, yes, I wrote it. Of course, ChatGPT just didn't exist. It wasn't even born in 2012, it wasn't launched until 10 years later. yet in that instance it said, yeah, I wrote it. So it's done some analysis of it and it's made a determination of, yeah, that sounds like the sort of thing that I might have written. And so it's given that false piece of advice to the user. So it's really dangerous. And again, I'll reference that FE Week article because it really was very good. And there were some examples and some real concerns in there around how it can disadvantage people who aren't native speakers of English, because actually when they're writing, they might tend to write in a way that's slightly more formal than their native English speaking kind of colleagues and counterparts. And ChatGPT and the people that have assessed that work have looked at it, and because it's quite formal, have said, oh, that's a high chance that that's been produced by ChatGPT, and it hasn't. And it's really harmful, I think, to learners to make that accusation for it not to be true for obvious reasons. So I will, in answer to that question, I'll do a bit more research and try and get a definitive answer to that. But certainly from the research I've done to date, it does scrape it to train a model. Yeah. I'm trying desperately to think of the point I was going to make before, and I can't, so I'm going to move on. Okay.
Jake, there's also another question.
Brilliant. Thanks, Abby. Okay. So sometimes ChatGPT also gives non-existent references when you're assessing a piece of work with academic series. Just be careful. Yeah, it does. And I've seen that happen. It literally will make up references. So it's really concerning to me that it would do something like that. And that's why I would never rely on it to produce any piece of work, to be honest, no matter whether it were big or small. I would always check it. And that's part of our key policy around advising learners on using it. Super. Thank you. Okay, so I said we'd have a little mini sort of case study here, and I thought Deloitte was a really interesting one to look at. So there was an article in the FT, again, I think it was the back end of last year, around Deloitte and how they were really embracing generative AI in their workplace. And what they've done is they've developed their own system, which is called PairD, and it's an AI tool that they've granted access to 75,000 of their staff members. Now, I think it's really interesting and really insightful that they've developed their own tool when there are off-the-shelf tools like ChatGPT and others that we've just described. And I think they've generated their own tool because they realize the risks that are associated with using another tool, especially if you're an organization like Deloitte and the stuff that you're going to be inputting into is probably highly commercially sensitive. Well, I wouldn't put that sort of information into a system if I didn't really know where it was going to end up. But of course, in order to produce something like an AI model, you need significant economies of scale, and the likes of Deloitte have got that. So they've kind of made that huge investment and they've rolled it out to all of their staff. And what it'll do, it's intended to speed up their work. It can summarize big documents for them. It answers emails. It can draft content. It automates tasks. It can even write code. So, you know, really will kind of supercharge what they do as an organization. But they're very acutely aware of the risks. And what they've said is that any staff member at Deloitte who wants to use PairD has to undergo training before they're actually allowed to start using it. And I think that that's very sensible and is also kind of very insightful, to be honest.
Jake, there's just two more questions in the chat box.
Thank you very much, Abby. I'll check those now. Okay, so can you please share if we got all you mentioned? Yeah, no problem, Michael. What I'll do is, Abby, can you just make a note for me, please? And then when we send the slides out, we'll attach a link to that article, or I can just embed the link in the slide deck. It was really impressive. It was a good article, really insightful. And then a question from Alex, when you're talking about ChatGPT and its inaccuracies, are you talking about 3.5 or the paid ChatGPT 4.0? That's a good question. So my personal experience of it, which does involve numerous inaccuracies, is 3.5. So I'm not myself using yet the paid version of it. But from the research and the reading I've done is that the same risk exists even if you're using 4.0. But it's a good question, Alex, and again, it's one I'll go away and get a definitive answer to, so I can share that when we share the slides. Okie dokie. 1 minute. Shall we move on? All right. So we've looked then at how it's been adopted by the employers. Next, let's look at how it's being used in the world of training. Okay, so generative AI in education. So DFE produced quite a good report, actually, which again, it's worth reading. It's quite hefty. but I've tried to summarize kind of the key outputs of it here. So they interviewed people across the FE and HE sector and asked them about how they're currently using it. Now, interestingly, I think the majority of people that responded were people that were using it, which in a way is good, because the people that aren't using it aren't really going to give you many useful responses. So the benefits, according to DFE and according to the educators that they spoke to, were that it can be used to create educational resources. So kind of, workbooks and training modules and things like that. But I think the key one is the individualized content for learners. And again, that's where the more sophisticated users of it might begin to adopt stuff like machine learning that I described before, where it has been around for a while, really. Actually, it's something like machine learning. When we think about diagnostic assessments, functional skills, we had these 10 years ago where, for example, and it's a fairly basic example of it, but you might have a learner who goes on and begins answering maths questions, and then the platform will tailor the next question based on how well or how badly they answered the previous question. And what it'll aim to do is that by the end of the assessment, it'll say, okay, well, you're at entry level 3, or you're at level 1, or you're at level 2. So that type of technology kind of does exist and has been used in education for quite a while now, actually. But I think with the advent and availability of more sophisticated AI, that's where the benefits are going to come in terms of creating that individualized content. So it's not just used for a diagnostic at the beginning, but it's used to tailor learning programs for learners so that they get the best experience, but also it really pushes them to achieve the highest grades that they can. The key one, streamline administrative tasks. This is by far the most common one that I've come across when I've spoken to training providers about how they're using AI. And it's about stuff like diary management, scheduling in meetings with line managers, with apprentices and that sort of thing. And what that does is it really frees up their time to spend quality time with the learners, which is what they want to do and where they feel like they deliver the best value. So in that respect, I think AI is not nicking your job. It's actually just there to streamline your job if you can kind of get access to the technology and use it effectively. I don't think AI is very good at assessing currently, to be honest, and I wouldn't want to see a learner whose whole experience is just delivered by a robot, by an artificial intelligence model. I want that human interaction because I think that richness is really important. But it can be used for stuff like lesson and curriculum planning, and grading, assessment and feedback. I think there are some early adopters in that, but I think there's a long way to go there for us to be confident that that's being done reliably and effectively and will lead to valid assessment, decisions and outcomes. So the concerns are around academic misconduct, and I think this is by far probably the most prevalent one. And by that, we essentially mean, learners cheating and using AI to generate content that they then attempt to pass off as their own. Over-reliance amongst pupils was cited as a concern. So, where if they're not using traditional methods to seek out information and they're just putting stuff into GTP, they're losing those kind of key research skills of going to different sources of data and understanding the risks associated with different types of sources of data and the benefits, and having that real blend of research. If you're doing all of your research on AI, you're not going to learn very much and you're not going to produce your best work. Now, interestingly, I think that over-reliance extends beyond the world of education. I think it extends into the world of work. And I've had this conversation with a number of people lately, actually, where we're increasingly using it to do what were previously sort of manual tasks. And a lot of people are using it with Excel and things like that. But there is a risk, I think, in the longer term that we lose some of the core skills because we become reliant on technology to do those things for us. That might not be a bad thing, because if some of those core skills are irrelevant because they're not needed anymore, fine. But actually, if they're core skills that underpin wider performance in the workplace, then I think it does become a concern. Another concern was around data protection and privacy. So that's the individual, the example that I gave of the individual input in their own kind of intellectual property, that's a concern, but also around people not using the technology responsibly or in line with organizational policies and putting stuff in there that actually you really shouldn't be putting in there because it's people's personal data. And then the final concern on there, which is a real concern of mine, is around worsening the digital divide. So I'm sure everyone's come across this term now, and it's used to describe kind of divisions in access to technology based on people's socioeconomic backgrounds. And what we have seen and are seeing increasingly is that people from more affluent backgrounds have more access to the hardware and the software that's needed to use AI. And so we're seeing, an even bigger kind of gap emerging in terms of access to education, in terms of how people perform in their world of work and how they perform when they're being educated and assessed. And I think the advancement of AI, unless it's kind of monitored, is potentially going to worsen that significantly. So that was a bit about how it's used in education. I'd be interested if there are any kind of questions or comments or insights there, because the majority of people are obviously being on the webinar from training providers. Might be something we pause till the end, but I'm really interested if you've got examples of where you're using it that you wouldn't mind sharing with the group. I think that's where we'll get the real benefit from this session. But it is worth noting, you'll see at the end there, that most of the respondents to that survey felt that the benefits did outweigh the concerns. But that's where I think the risk is, in that the majority of people, if not all of the people that responded, were obviously people that were adapting that technology. So by their nature, they're going to be tech savvy and they're going to want to experiment with it and use it. So I think if you asked everybody, including those that weren't using it, the answer to that question might be slightly different, I suspect. Okay, I haven't seen any questions pop in, so I'll move on to the next one, but I'm happy to kind of pause and go back. Okay, we're at about 10 to, so we've got plenty of time. So finally, in terms of the three categories, I wanted to talk about awarding orgs, because obviously we're an awarding organisation. We carried out, 11,000 apprentices endpoint assessments now, so we've got a lot of experience of this, and I wanted to just share our insights and stuff we've got from work we've done with other EPAs and awarding orgs through things like the Quality Alliance and things. I think there might be a question there, so I'm just going to check.
Yeah, there is a question.
Yeah, so have DSW got a policy or risk assessment around the use of AI that could be shared with providers? Yes, we have. I'll also take an action, and Nabi, if you don't mind, just to make sure I definitely follow up on it, is to share that with the slide deck. And what I will say is that policy is changing all the time. It's adapting, and I think it needs to, because the advancement of the technology changes so quickly. So I think with a lot of policies, as awarding orgs and training providers, we've probably got annual review of certain policies, but I think with stuff like AI, we need to consider reviewing those things more frequently. Okay, got a couple more comments, questions in there. So one from Jason. So we've used this to support some curriculum builds and learner guidance, but there's a fine line to balance what's guidance and what's just too much information. Yeah, so that's a really great point. And actually, we have a similar thing when we produce what we call amplification. So we're assessing apprenticeship standards that might have sort of KSBs in them, but a lot of the time, particularly the older ones, are quite ambiguous. And so we'll work to produce the amplification to build upon that. And that is an area where we might use something like GTP. So we wouldn't use it for, we wouldn't input a learner's information into it or their kind of work. We wouldn't use it to create live assessment materials, but I have used it to create stuff like amplification. So anything that's going to be out in the public domain anyway, there's no reason that we wouldn't kind of put that in. So yeah, I think we've done something similar, Jason, in terms of we get the AI to produce it, but actually if we just copied and pasted what ChatGPT, potentially we're kind of spoon feeding the answer to the learners, and we really want them to demonstrate that they've got enough prompt to understand what we're looking for, but that they've got the nous to be able to then do their own research, give their own examples of where they've applied that in their workplace and so forth. And then finally, there's another question or a comment on there. So we have used it as a starting point for PowerPoint presentations when we're going to deliver a new program. As mentioned, it's only a starting point, and you certainly have to check and add info. And again, completely agree with that. It's often, I think, the starting points where I would use it, and then I would reshape what it's put in and sense check what it's put in, and maybe get a colleague to kind of peer review that as well before it's published. So brilliant, thank you. Okay, so awarding orgs. So what are we doing in terms of AI? Okay, so I mentioned there, actually, I've jumped ahead. So if it's anything public facing, then I'm comfortable with us using it. So when we're talking about the amplification, when we're talking about preparatory materials, so that might be, for example, a template for producing a report or a project that's assessed as part of your EPA. Mock assessments. So actually, there's no reason why we can't use it to produce the mock assessments because they're publicly facing anyway. And it just allows us to do those more efficiently and more speedily. We can get, so we can have more of them. And policies. So when we're designing kind of policies on things like reasonable adjustments, AI policy, things like that, we might use AI to help inform that. But with all of those things in place where we understand what we need to input into it, and then we're sense checking what it's putting out there. We also use it for data analysis and insights. So increasingly, so what we want to be able to do is kind of live data analysis. So we will always be looking, obviously, at a particular apprenticeship standard, for example, and we'll know from the analysis that we do currently, okay, well, this particular KSB seems to be problematic because a higher proportion of learners fail it. It's really easy to do that on something like an MCQ, like a multiple choice test paper. If question 28's got quite a high fail rate, let's dig down and discover why that is. I think what AI is increasingly allowing us to do is to do that in real time. So rather than saying, okay, once a month, let's run a report and check the data, the AI is constantly doing that for us and saying, right, you might have an issue here and flagging it in real time, which I think is just really good in terms of consistency and a better user experience. We do use it for plagiarism detection, but as I mentioned, even by DFE's own admission, that technology's already fallen behind the cheat technology's ability to kind of adapt and produce new content that just we can't keep up with. So I think the human touch and the training that we give to our assessors and IQAs and identifying it is really important, particularly with the assessors, because I think if it's identified in IQA, it's already happened. If an assessor picks on it and suspects there's some malpractice or plagiarism there, then they can ask them and they can really drill in on that when they do the assessment. Remote proctorers, this is a really interesting one, actually. So we will, at DSW soon, be launching a record and review, which I'm sure a lot of people are already familiar with, but this is where, say if an apprentice is sitting a multiple choice exam paper, rather than having a human proctor that's on screen and instructing them and monitoring what they're doing, it's actually done by AI, which is a much more reliable and consistent way of doing it because the AI can be trained to do all of the usual sort of housekeeping stuff like scan the room, make sure there aren't any visual aids in there, make sure they're alone and in a secure and quiet environment, that they haven't got a smartwatch on and haven't got headphones in, all of those things. But what it will also do is it'll send a report to us to say, okay, on this particular one, you might want to check the following green flags, red flags, amber flags, because it looks like something might have happened. So it's a much more reliable way of doing it. We are kind of in discussions with Ofqual because we know it's widely used actually in the awarding organisation space. So we're just seeking to get some explicit clarification issued that it is something Ofqual are comfortable with. And then finally, for accessibility and reasonable adjustments. So AI, I mentioned earlier, stuff like adaptive testing. So I think, when it comes to accessibility and reasonable adjustments, stuff like text to speech and speech to text really helps with people that might have audio or visual impairments. And that's just a basic example of it, but there are loads of opportunities there. And we'll continue to work with other awarding orgs and organizations like Cognisist as well to look at what platforms are emerging and how we can harness those. But then also the adaptive testing that I mentioned before. And really, I think where AI, if I give an example of where I think it could be used in something like an interview, where you might think, okay, there's not an obvious application for it there, but actually I think what AI can do quite effectively is identify opportunities for holistic assessment, and there are technology like this that exist currently. So a learner might be given responses to the interview questions that they're being asked with their independent assessor. And what we often find in that scenario is that the learner might give quite a detailed response to a question, and in that response, they might have actually covered another area that was due to be assessed, or at least a part of that area. And currently, what we rely on as awarding orgs is the skill of the assessor and the training that we've given to identify that and make a mental note of, right, okay, I don't need to ask that question later on because they've already answered it, or actually I can adjust that question because they've answered part of it. But what the AI can do is it can do that in real time. And so it can be adjusting or making recommended adjustments to the question bank in real time. So a lot of assessment plans will ask us to give a bank of questions to the assessor ahead of the assessment. And they might tweak those questions based on the evidence they've seen in the portfolio. And so they're going to contextualize it. But I think a real benefit of something like AI in that scenario is it just aids the assessor in being able to do that. So rather than the assessor using their kind of cognitive space, if you like, to assess holistically, they're listening to what the apprentice is said and thinking about kind of how they're going to adjust it, but the AI is really assisting them and saying, right, okay, well, actually, you can tweak question 3 to say this instead of this. I think that would be really useful. Also, in terms of them scaffolding questions. So if you've got an apprentice who's answering questions and you think, I could add a little bit onto that question and that kind of gets them from a pass to a distinction, that's something that we train our assessors to do. But again, you're relying on the skill of the assessor in doing that. And the AI can be monitoring that all of the time and advising the assessor and saying, okay, you could add this bit onto the question. And so they're just using it not to replace the assessor, because I think that would be a terrible mistake, but actually to help the assessor in kind of carrying out their role as effectively and as consistently as they can. Okay, I think we've had a couple of questions there, Abby, so I'll just...
Yeah,
pause
I
again.
was just going to say there's a couple of questions.
Thank you. Okay, so does undetectable.ai change the text so that if you're using a plagiarism detector, it won't pick up the fact that it's been written using AI? I'm just going to read that again. So does undetectable.ai change the text so that if you're using a plagiarism detector, it won't pick up the fact that it has been written using an AI? So the answer to that one, Rizwan, is my understanding, yes. So I think there are loads of sort of either platforms or sort of mods for existing platforms that do exactly that sort of thing. So they kind of know what, so if we think of the tech that we might be using to detect, right, these are patterns of writing that strongly indicate that it's AI generated. Well, these technologies that are emerging, they know what those patterns are, so they'll just tweak the text and make it sound less like it's been artificially generated. And that type of technology is moving at a much quicker pace than the type of technology that we have access to that's designed to detect that. So that's why I think we need to think about the bigger picture and the longer term future here, because I think it's futile, to be honest, for us to keep saying, oh, well, let's update our tech to catch their tech. It's a ridiculous race that we'll probably lose. We're better off thinking more fundamentally about how we actually teach people and how we assess them, and which types of assessment, for example, are more difficult to get around. Another comment there from our end. So we use JCQ policies to guide what we do or don't advise as an AO. And yeah, I would recommend that actually, because when I created our policy on AI, JCQ was a go-to document for me because they created quite a robust policy. Interestingly, there were elements of the JCQ that were sort of slightly criticised, I think, in the FE week report. But I think from everything I've seen, I'd say the JCQ one's an excellent one, but it just speaks to and reinforces the point I made earlier that we can't just have a policy and say that's our AI policy for the year. We need to be refreshing it all of the time to make sure that it's adaptive to what's out there and is protecting us against the risks. Okay, one from Tracy. So with leadership management, the portfolio is not assessed. So if AI use is suspected, the portfolio cannot be failed. However, as you've said, the EPA can delve further and ask questions. So use of AI by a learner in this case doesn't matter as long as they've shown how they've applied knowledge in the workplace. So really good point and question, Tracy. So with a non-assessed portfolio, the direction we've been given as an award and all by both IFA and Ofqual is you obviously can't assess it, you can't reject it. And so you're completely right. So the portfolio, if it's not assessed, that means there's an assessment method attached to it, which is usually like an interview or a PD. So yeah, that's where you would seek to say, right, okay, in your portfolio, you've talked about this particular piece of legislation. Can you just tell me kind of how that affects your role and what you do in your organization? And you'd be able to tell straight away whether or not they truly understand that thing that they've written about. So does it matter? I would say not, because I'd say if in the assessment you've determined that they do know what they're talking about, it's irrelevant really what they put in their portfolio, because the assessment is the actual interview. It's a really good question. I think that would be my view on it. So long as they're passing the assessment, what they put in their portfolio is irrelevant. But if they have genuinely cheated and not bothered to read up on it and they put it in their portfolio, I do believe they would be caught out in the assessment anyway. So it's pretty robust in that respect. So one from Paul, not a question, But NVIDIA, the market leader in AI microchips, has released its latest one, which can operate 30 times faster, doing some tasks quicker than others. That's really useful, Paul. Thank you. Abby, if you don't mind as well, we'll both take a note to share Paul's link, because I think that it sort of just supercharges everything that we're talking about, doesn't it?
I've taken a note, thanks.
Brilliant, yeah. So I mean, that's great in terms of that might help us to develop technology more quickly to detect it, but also it's going to help the bad actors to develop their technology more quickly. So that's why I said at the beginning, actually, I think it would be foolish to think that in this trough of disillusionment and AI is just going to disappear. It ain't. If anything, it's going to become faster and more prevalent and more dangerous if it's not used properly. Okay, one from an anonymous. So intrigued is your reticence to use for live exams, only mock and preparatory stuff. Why wouldn't you potentially use it to draft live question banks? Given that you've already identified as imperfect and necessity of using collaboration with human intelligence, it still has the potential to, if trained on the correct source material, take the legwork out of initial drafts. This leaves question writers to refine and improve. Yeah, so I think that's a good question, and it's one that I've certainly battled with myself. So I personally haven't seen anything from Ofqual that explicitly says that we can't, as awarding organisations, use AI to generate content for live exams. But I have spoken to a number of other AOs who believe that that's the case, or feel like they've been told that kind of off the record, if you like, by Ofqual. So for that reason, I've been slightly risk averse in terms of the work that I oversee at DSW. But I think there is that risk still, that unanswered question, is if we put stuff into AI, where does it go and how secure is it? So even if, say, OpenAI, who own ChatGPT, even if they said, well, we're not going to do anything malicious with it or share it with anybody, we've kind of given away that information and that data and just trusted that they're going to handle it responsibly and they're not going to be hacked and somebody's going to get it. I think it's highly unlikely, but I just think until we know more about the technology and kind of what happens and what the risks are, I personally would be reluctant to use it for live questions. And I get the point actually as well. It's a really good comment there actually, from Anonymous, that we've identified it isn't perfect and that we're likely to have to change the output of it. So I think if we used it as a starting point and fundamentally changed what it said, then I probably potentially would be happy to use that content in a live exam because it's fundamentally different to what we've inputted into the AI platform anyway. But if we'd input it into the AI and said, oh, I've got 10 questions then, they're brilliant, I don't need to change them. Personally, I'll be very reluctant to use those 10 questions simply because they're now in that bank that's accessible to somebody outside of DSW that I no longer have any control over. I feel much more confident knowing that they're on our servers and we've got our own processes in place to manage it. Okay, another one from our end. So I don't understand how we'd use AI in a practical sense to help assessors scaffold questions on the spot. How would they use AI in that moment when asking questions of a student? Sorry, it might be a stupid question. I'm just very interested in how we can use it to improve assessment for AOs. It's absolutely not a stupid question. And until very recently, I would have thought that to be impossible, if not impractical. But again, I'm going to reference the FE Week article because I kind of started clicking on lots of different links and looking at different things as a result of reading that. And there is technology that's out there on the market that's being advertised, where it's positioned and it's being sold and marketed as something you could use, say, in a job interview. And you have these things called sort of hidden headphones, sorry. That is kind of very hard to detect, and you can put them in and you can have this AI, and what the AI will do is it will listen to the question in real time and it will read back to you a suggested response literally in real time. How practical that is, I don't know, but I can imagine that as that technology evolves, stuff like that will become more sophisticated and easier to purchase and acquire and easier to kind of use. So I think that in that kind of scenario, maybe in a couple of years' time, you could use that technology for good in that example of where, okay, you've got an assessor asking questions, the apprentice is giving their response, the AI is literally listening to the responses, digesting what the apprentice has said, making a determination as to, right, okay, I think they've already answered that bit, or they're almost at distinction. And then so in real time, either in the assessor's ear or on their screen, it's saying, suggest the following amendment. And I think it's thinking a little bit further into the future, but I predict personally that's how it might evolve. One from Mark. Awfully sorry I cannot see the other panelists' questions. I think we've deliberately done that, Mark, just from a GDPR point of view. But what I'm happy to do is take an action as to kind of what questions were asked and then the responses that we gave to them as well, because I want it all to be transparent for everyone to have a reference point as to what we've discussed today. Well, thank you. So I'll move on to the next section now. So I think we're almost at the end of the presentation, actually. So we should still have plenty of time for questions as well. Oh, actually, yeah, this is a further point on there around the award and orgs bit. Sorry. So we talked about authoring, we've talked about adaptive testing, we've talked about assessment and grading. The final one on there, standardization, internal and external, I think is potentially a massive game changer for us, because every conference that I've been to for the last couple of years, the main thing that comes up, and particularly a concern of training providers, which I completely understand and completely agree with, is this lack of standardization of endpoint assessment organizations. And it's something collectively as EPAs we're equally concerned about. And we are doing work actually through the Federation of Awarding Bodies, through the Quality Alliance, that a number of us are a member of, in terms of self-standardizing, which is great, but it's limited in its scope. It's relying on the altruism of those EPOs who've got the time and the inclination to invest in doing that. And it doesn't include everybody. And if you're not including everybody, it's not pointless, but it doesn't deliver the same value as it does. So it's ultimately, I think, in the long term, something that we're pressing for is mandated standardization, which is facilitated by Ofqual or IFA or one of the regulators. Because until that happens, it's never going to be as effective as it needs to be. But I do think there's potentially a role in AI in the future of standardizing our assessment decisions. So, for example, and again, I'm thinking kind of, right into the future here. But if we could sort of anonymously submit records of our assessments through to, say, Ofqual, who had an AI team, and it might be pie in the sky, but I think this something like this could be a benefit. What they're doing is they're then analysing the different responses that might be in an interview or it might be in a report, but all the different responses that apprentices given the questions on the same standard. So it's the same KSPs. And what the AI will be able to do is it'll be able to say, right, okay, organisation 1 is assessing that KSP much more leniently than organisations 2 and 3 are. And so it's that data-driven standardisation, which I think is the game changer, because the real reason I think that we're not seeing this mandated standardization is that it's just such an enormous undertaking for the regulator to take on and for the EPOs to take on. It would massively kind of slow down everything that we did. But if it was driven by data, which said, right, okay, largely speaking, you don't need to standardize on these areas because you're on the same page anyway, but we've identified these little learning outcomes and we hone in on those areas. And then over time, we start to really tackle the bigger picture. And I think that is where AI could be a real game changer and a force for good. And the same example there, we could do that internally within. So we could do that across our portfolio of standards. So that was standardizing not just on individual standards, but also we're doing it across all of the 37 standards that we assess. And that has been done based purely on data as well. Well, not purely on data, but it's been driven by the data. And then we can make informed decisions as to, right, okay, yeah, that does suggest that there's something we need to focus on there. I think that's a massive opportunity that we should look to embrace. Okay, so just to recap on the general risks. So there's the job displacement, and I think it's going to largely displace all of our jobs in the immediate future? No. I think what it's going to do in the immediate future is it's going to enhance our jobs and it's going to help us to focus on the areas where we think we deliver the most value and the best experiences for learners. In the longer term, potentially, yeah, it will. And I think it would be naive of us to say no, it won't, but it's something to keep a watching brief on, I think. Another risk, the dependence on it. So I said before, there's the learner's dependence on it in terms of them not developing the skills that they need to research things and really kind of critically evaluate things if they're just depending on and tweaking a response from an AI. But also in the world of work, there's a risk that we begin to lose some of the core skills that we have because we're getting AI to do everything. Security and privacy, and that includes things like the intellectual property of the work that we're putting into there, really thinking about who that belongs to and do we have their consent to put it into a system that then goes into some cloud that we no longer have access to. Bias and discrimination is not something I've talked too much about, but it's widely recognized that a lot of these AI models have inbuilt biases and discriminations, and they have those because they're trained on the stuff that we put in. So if we're training them to be biased and to discriminate, which it seems in many cases we are, then they're going to assume that that's right, and they're going to repeat that then when they're advising their users on what to say, how to answer something. And then another general risk is citation and referencing. So when it comes to the world of work, my view and the view of DSW is we absolutely embrace the fact that apprentices might be submitting work for assessment that's been created by AI. And it might be because they work for Deloitte. And we can see that Deloitte requires them to use AI because they've invested heavily in that particular platform. I think the key things are, can the learner demonstrate that they used it in line with their organization's policies? And they can prove that by giving you a copy of the policy or having a witness statement from the line manager. Have they demonstrated that they've prompted it effectively? So we have this whole kind of cottage industry now around prompt engineers, might be a term you've come across, where you're trained in actually understanding how to prompt an AI in the most efficient possible way so that you're giving it the relevant information to get the best possible output. So there's that prompting of the AI, first of all, so that you're putting the right information in, because your output's only as good as your input. And then the final key bit is, once you've got that output from the AI, what have you done to fact check it? Is that you've gone to another kind of resource on the internet, or you've gone to a book to check that and see if it's true, that you've checked that the references it's given you are accurate. You've had a peer review by somebody that you work with. So really topping and tailing it. So have you used it in line with your organizational policy? Have you used it effectively in terms of what you've told it to do? Have you checked the output to make sure that it doesn't include biases, to include that the information is accurate, that sort of thing?
Jake, there's a couple of questions.
Well, okay, I'll go to those. And then I think supporting learners might be our final slide, actually. Okay. So as language models like ChatGPT continue to evolve, what tips do you give us to stay informed about the latest developments and best practices to ensure responsible and effective use within our organization? Really good, great question. And actually, I think that's an area where I personally have struggled, is the keeping informed bit, because the problem is there's so much information out there. There isn't one centralized bit. I think in terms of providers and endpoint assessment organizations, I would look at the kind of membership bodies that we've got. So the likes of AELP, Federation of Awarding Bodies, the Quality Alliance of Endpoint Assessment Organizations, because as confederations and federations like those, it's incumbent on us to be doing that research on behalf of our members and then summarizing it. So I think as a minimum is joining as many of those organizations as you can and using those organizations to kind of funnel the relevant information, keeping abreast of stuff through kind of educational supplements and newspapers and websites, doing your own independent research. But also I think the stuff that DFE put out is really critical as well. It's not that frequent because they're a government body and they move quite slowly, but the stuff that they put out is always relevant and, in my views, quite often insightful. LinkedIn as well. But as an output of this, and I'm always very keen that we get outputs from workshops and webinars and stuff, is if anybody's interested in kind of having an AI kind of working group, which could be a mixture of employers, EPOs, providers, I'll be more than happy to kind of start a conversation there and see if that's something that's got legs. Again, so that I think we're all in it together, and we made this an open webinar today because it's not, I don't think I'm sharing anything that's commercially sensitive, and I think the only way that we're going to protect ourselves as an industry, as a sector against it, is if we work collectively and share the information and insights we've got, because it's moving so quickly. It will be a full-time job for somebody to even keep on top of kind of what's emerging. Another question or comment. I'm very interested to receive more information about products out there that are available, which could help improve assessment for AOs. Perhaps any data on the usefulness of these tools. For example, the technology you mentioned where Q&A could be listened to, the scaffold be suggested on the spot by AI. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, most people probably know DSW is a founder member of the Quality Alliance of EPOs, and we've got, so we don't require EPOs to pay. So if there are any organisations, awarding orgs that want to be part of that alliance and aren't currently, get in touch with me and I'm happy to kind of put you in touch and get you added to that. There's no commitment, there's no cost associated with it. And within that group, we have separate working groups. I am always mindful of the fact that we also have groups like FAB's EPA group, and what we don't want to do is duplicate work or kind of step on each other's toes. So we're always kind of looking to keep in touch with other groups and make sure that we're working in synergy really, and getting the most out of the work that we're doing. So yeah, absolutely, as part of the Quality Alliance, it's something that we're looking at. So if you're not already a member, please do join, and we can set up a separate working group there. But beyond that, I'll be really keen as well to either broaden that group or set up a group that includes training providers as well, because I think there's a real symbiosis between what we're doing, and if we have independent ways of thinking about it and approaching it, it's probably not going to work. So Rizwan, a working group we've got so beneficial, brilliant. That's good to know. Karen, if you do arrange a working group, we'd be interested in joining. Fantastic. It sounds like there's already a lot of opportunity there. So what I might suggest with a working group then is if I pick that up with the Quality Alliance, and that we set up a broader working group where we bring training providers into it as well, and employers if they want to be involved. I think that would be great. That's good to hear. So thank you. Okay, we're almost there. Thanks for sticking with us. Okay, so finally then, if we talk about how do we support the learners. So we've looked at how it's been used by employers, educators, awarding orgs. We know now what the risks are. The key bit is how we're developing and supporting the learners. And I think the clear and robust policies is essential. So the policies are around how we might protect ourselves in terms of identifying plagiarism, but they're also about the things that we've talked about, like how do we support the learners and saying, look, it's fine if you want to use AI, but you need to be really clear and reference it and talk about how you've used it responsibly and effectively. And I think it's only through the policies that we can communicate that clearly and police it in the way that we need to. Supporting them by instructing them not to include personal identifiable data, and that's their own data as well as the data of other people that they might work with. We see all the time in the world of endpoint assessment, kind of frequent GDPR breaches. With the best will in the world, somebody shares a slide and they haven't realized they put somebody's contact details on it, or some sort of GDPR breach. The fact that we see that so commonly, and we continue to see it in EPA, suggests to me that if those same learners are using AI, they're probably making the same mistakes with AI. So it's just educating them on the risks of that and helping them to avoid doing it. Remembering that their content's their own IP, it's not ours to do with what we choose, and that includes inputting it into AI. And that DFE report that I referenced earlier on is well worth a read, and DFE themselves even state in that we need to be aware of that we don't own that IP, and without their consent, we should not be putting it into a generative AI model. We need to build processes to limit exposure to content that's harmful, inappropriate, or discriminatory. So, a lot of this is apprentices accessing stuff on their own devices at home. How do we make sure that we're monitoring that and limiting that? And again, I think that's done through education and through policies that enforce that. So training staff as well on how to identify where that might have occurred. We've covered that point a lot. So referencing and citing it, it's fine for them to use it, but in the same way as if they quoted something from a website or a book that they'd read, if they didn't reference it, we would consider that to be malpractice. And then ensuring that the access to the technology is equitable. So, that digital divide, there's increasing bodies of research out there that are proving that the digital divide's real, and that the faster the technology advances, the faster that gap widens. So it's thinking about how we promote access and make sure that there's equal access as far as possible for anybody, regardless of who they are and where they are. And that's it. So we've still got sort of 5 or 6 minutes. If there are any additional questions, I'll just have a quick look in the question box. Yeah, another 3, 4, 5 comments saying people would love to join the group. So that's fantastic. Well, that's great. We'll pick up on that then. I think that'll be a good initiative. And then finally, there's another comment here from our end. So not a question, but I would love a working group. But then there is a question after that, sorry. So how can we train staff about misuse of AI where there's no opportunity for Q&A? There are so many simple things to do to make ChatGPT sound less generic. You can add prompts such as write in the style I've shown here, or just change some of the words a bit. You can churn it through other AI so it's not as obvious, etc. Gemini uses a much more natural flow of language, which isn't obvious as well. Yeah, and I think that's where we need to have the working group. So I think for all, we have our own kind of policies and processes and ways of working, I've always been of the view, actually, when you come to things like malpractice, when you come to things like AI, when you come to things like reasonable adjustments, broadly speaking, we should all have the same, similar policies, if not the same. And I think that's where the likes of the work that JCQ does is really good, because that can be widely adopted by kind of a number of assessment orgs. But absolutely, I mean, I'd be more than happy for us to almost work on a kind of joint AI policy, or at least something that's got guidance in so that we can identify that potential misuse. Because I think one thing that we touched on but haven't spoken too much about is the real risk of false positives, false negatives, and examples where we're accusing people of using AI and actually they haven't used it, which in many ways I think is more harmful than not identifying when somebody has used it. I think it's potentially more harmful to penalize somebody for using it when they haven't. The truth of it is I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to prove that somebody's used AI. And I mentioned before, I've seen loads of portfolios where I'm fairly certain that they have, because you can just sort of tell it sticks out like a sore thumb. And in those instances, what we've done is we've gone back to the training provider and said, look, this looks like it's AI. You might want to investigate it a little bit further. And they've gone on to do it and actually subsequently said, yeah, it was. And they've admitted it, or they didn't realize that they weren't supposed to use it. But it's very difficult for us to say that's a fail because you've used AI, because often you can't tell. So I think that's where the working group can probably identify collectively how do we overcome that. And I think it is probably through, if it's married to another assessment method, it's then how do we have those questioning techniques in the interview or in the PD to sort of catch them out, for want of a better term. Great. Looks like there's a few more questions in there, so I'm happy to keep going. So Rizwan, as a reflection for us, there needs to be training on the use of AI to embrace it, as well as further training in-house on GDPR. And then one more question. I've seen information on creating your own AI model. You could create one specific to apprenticeships, etc. That would be absolutely fantastic. Way out of my area of expertise, but if that's something that we can identify as part of the working group and we've got that expertise within the group, then absolutely, I think that would be brilliant. But I think the more we can do, the better, really. And then Marcus, sorry, yeah, I'll read that one out. That's great. Brilliant. Well, I'll assume there aren't any more questions, and we're pretty much bang on past, so that's absolutely fantastic. I just want to say a huge thank you. Still got 60 people on, so well done, everybody. Sorry you've just had to listen to my voice for an hour and a half, but hopefully it's been useful and insightful. And I'm really happy that we've got an output here in terms of creating a working group. So that's great. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful day. And we'll see you shortly.